The British Churchill heavy infantry tank climbed a mountain ridge in Tunisia in 1943, a place the German command physically could not conceive of an armored attack. They simply wrote off that slope from their calculations, and they were wrong. The vehicle, which from its very birth had been called obsolete, a write-off, and a disgrace to British tank building, suddenly outflanked the enemy from a height where, by all laws of physics, a heavy tank had no business being. It is from this episode that the real story of the Churchill begins, a relic from the First World War that managed to become one of the hardiest tanks of 1945. Here's the deal. If today you hear at least one fact that's new to you, you owe me a like. If I haven't surprised you with anything and all this is old news for you, feel free to hit dislike. And we're starting. The official version of this machine is roughly this. In 1939, expecting a positional war along the lines of 1914, the British designed a slow, long, heavily armored tank with tracks running around the entire hull, like the rhomboid monsters of the First World War. The vehicle turned out to be crude, broke down constantly, and Winston Churchill himself, in whose honor it was named, publicly spoke of it with withering sarcasm. The tank bearing his name had more flaws than he did. That, generally, is where the story is supposed to end. An outdated concept, an embarrassing debut, a few upgrades, and forget it. But here's what doesn't fit this picture. If the machine was such a failure, why did the Churchill become the basis for the most diverse arsenal of specialized engineering vehicles of the entire war? Why was it specifically the Churchill, and not some other tank, that the Soviet command specifically requested via Lend-Lease for specific operations on the Eastern Front? And why did the Mark 7 with 152 millimeters of frontal armor, more than the German Tiger, see combat in 1945 and come out under its own power? To answer these questions, we'll have to examine not just the metal, but the very philosophy behind it. In 1939, the British Army viewed the tank fundamentally differently than the Germans. No deep breakthroughs, no independent raids. The tank was a mobile, armored shield for the infantry. It moves alongside the soldiers, absorbs fire, crushes machine gun nests, and goes where infantry cannot. It's not a racing car, it's an armored icebreaker. It was from this concept that the entire appearance of the machine grew. A low silhouette, tracks running the full perimeter to climb over shell craters and trenches, and the maximum possible armor at the expense of speed. Speed was simply not a priority. Infantry doesn't move fast. The first production modification, the Mark 1, appeared in 1941 and immediately confirmed the worst fears. It wouldn't move. It wouldn't shoot properly. It broke down for no apparent reason. Carburetors leaked, final drives seized, the Bedford engine overheated at the worst possible moment. Its actual combat debut at Dieppe in 1942 was a disaster. Most vehicles got stuck on the Pebble Beach before even reaching the German fortifications. This wasn't a failure of the concept. It was the result of monstrous haste in production. The factory was rushing to meet quotas. Quality control existed only on paper. Soldiers received machines that had to be finished by hand already in the units. This is precisely where the accepted version of the obsolete failed tank begins to crumble. Because after Dieppe, something happened that was rare in Soviet and German practice. The British War Ministry did not hush up the failure, but conducted a detailed analysis and issued industry a very specific list of demands. And industry, strangely enough, began to fulfill them. Modification after modification. Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV. The machine was methodically refined. This wasn't a brilliant engineering revolution, it was stubborn, methodical elimination of flaws. The British approach, pedantic, slow, but working. By 1943 in Tunisia, a completely different machine was fighting. It was there that the Churchill first showed its main trump card, its incredible cross-country ability. Here's my personal surprise. Until now, I thought talk of climbing cliffs was an exaggeration. But a fact is a fact. Mark III tanks climbed the Jebel Bu Aoukaz height with a gradient of about 30 degrees. A mountain route, in simple terms. The German command hadn't even prepared anti-tank positions there. According to all engineering calculations, armored vehicles could not appear there. The reason was simple. The Churchill's track width was greater than most contemporaries, its ground pressure was lower, and its center of gravity was extremely low due to its flat silhouette. Not speed, stability, and traction. Simultaneously in Tunisia, something else became clear. The armor worked. The vehicles took hits from 75mm guns, kept moving, and completed their mission. Crews began to trust their tank, and that is priceless in combat conditions. You can only sit in a machine slowly moving under fire if you believe the armor will hold. The Churchill earned that trust. The Soviet Union received about 250 Churchills of various modifications via Lend-Lease. In my opinion, Soviet tankers met this machine with undisguised skepticism, and one can understand them. After the T-34 with its dynamics, sitting in this coffin at 20 kilometers per hour waiting for a field kitchen to overtake you is quite the experience. There were plenty of complaints about maintenance too. The British lubrication system and English documentation at a Soviet tank repair plant looked roughly like an operating manual for a Mars rover. But at the same time, combat reports preserved in the archives of the Central Archive of the Russian Ministry of Defense show commanders of separate heavy tank regiments writing directly, "The machine is good for assaulting fortified positions. Specifically for assault, where you need to move slowly, under fire, and rely on armor. Not to chase the enemy, but to break through defenses." Near Leningrad, during the operation to break the blockade in 1943, Churchills were used exactly like that, as a heavy battering ram against German strongpoints. And they worked. There were losses, but the machines reached their objectives and completed their missions. And now about what most reviews of this machine prefer not to mention at all. The Churchill became the platform for the strangest and most effective combat vehicles of the entire war, the so-called Hobart's Funnies. Major General Percy Hobart was given command of the 79th Armored Division and set about turning standard tanks into something utterly unimaginable. For this, he needed a machine with a large internal volume, a reliable chassis, and good armor. The Churchill was perfect. Churchill Crocodile, a flamethrower tank. The standard gun was retained, but a trailer with 225 gallons of pressurized flammable mixture was added. A flamethrower mount instead of the forward machine gun. The flamethrower jet range, up to 120 meters. The specific destructive effect. If the burning mixture hits a bunker's embrasure, there is no protection for the crew. None. German soldiers feared these machines more than any other vehicle. Survivors testified to this repeatedly after the war. The Churchill AVRE, a self-propelled engineer gun. Instead of a regular cannon, a petard mortar of 290 millimeters caliber. It fired an 18-kilogram projectile. Crews called it the flying suitcase. Range, about 70 meters, but a hit on a concrete bunker meant its instant destruction. Rate of fire. One mortar required reloading from outside the turret, right under fire. Yes, exactly like that. The gunner would open the hatch, lean out, and manually load the next round. In Normandy in '44, these machines went first against the coastal fortifications and literally tore apart German casemates even before the infantry could reach them. There were also the Churchill Arc, a bridge layer, the Churchill Fascine, a machine for dropping bundles of brushwood into anti-tank ditches, the Churchill Snake, a trailer for an elongated mine-clearing charge. From the same base grew a whole zoo of specialized machines, without which the Normandy landing would have looked fundamentally different. This is no accident. It is a direct consequence of the designers initially making a vehicle with a large internal volume and a reliable chassis, even at the expense of speed. The final evolution of the Churchill, the Mark VII, adopted for service in 1944. 152 millimeters of frontal armor. This is not just a number, it's more than the Tigers. The QF 75mm gun, now a serious argument against German medium-class armor. The vehicle's weight increased to 40 tons. By previous standards, this is a disaster for cross-country mobility, but no, The chassis had been seriously reworked by then, and the vehicle retained its signature mountain climbing qualities. In Normandy and later in Germany, Churchill Mark 7s worked as heavy infantry support assault vehicles in exactly the role they were created for in '39. British armor researcher David Fletcher, in his work on the history of the Royal Armoured Corps, provides telling statistics. In the battles on the Anzio beachhead in 1944, Churchills took an average of 8 to 12 hits per engagement, and kept moving. German 75mm shells would only penetrate them through and through at distances closer than 200 meters. This is not a weak old tank. This is a machine that did exactly what was required of it. In the historiography of the Churchill, there is one episode that most analyses shy away from. When the Dieppe raid failed in 1942, German intelligence thoroughly studied the British machines stuck on the shore. The report sent to Berlin contained the conclusion, "The tank is obsolete. Its low speed makes it useless in maneuver warfare. Nothing to recommend for study." The Germans stopped there and did not dig deeper. They saw a slow vehicle and drew conclusions based on their own tank philosophy, where speed and breakthrough are paramount. They did not see or did not want to see that this vehicle had entirely different tasks. This cost them dearly in Tunisia, when Churchills went where they shouldn't have been able to, and at Cassino in '43, and in Normandy in '44. It turns out, this story is not about an obsolete tank, nor about the fortunate salvage of a failed project. It is about how a correctly formulated task ultimately yields the right tool, even if there was much pain, broken machines, and lost crews along the way. The Churchill was not fast. It was not elegant. It was not a technological breakthrough. But it was survivable, cross-country capable, and repairable. And in war, that is often more important than pretty specs on a chart. That's all for me today. If you liked the analysis, hit the like button. If you think the topic wasn't covered, give a dislike and write what I missed. See you in the next episode. This is part 2 of 2.